All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 13th Annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Jamie Machik with the Wisconsin Valley Library Service, and with me this morning is Leah Laneby from the IFLIS Library System, and we are starting our opening session. We are so glad you are all here. So our presenter for our opening session is Cassie Laporte, and Cassie works for, let me get that, the TLAM program at UW-Madison. And she's going to be talking about developing a personal cultural humility toolkit. Cassie will be taking questions throughout the presentation. So if you have a question, you can drop it in the chat or the Q&A, and we will monitor that. So Cassie, please begin.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Has everybody seen my slide? Can I get just a real quick thumbs up, making sure everyone's good before I proceed? Thank you, Jamie. I appreciate that. The amount of times I have taught a class and I've been like, oh yeah, now on this slide. And then finally someone pipes up and is like, I have no idea what you're talking about. There are no slides on the screen. So glad to see that you all can see my slides. Thank you for the introduction. I apologize that we're starting a few minutes late. It was 100% a technical difficulty on me that I was making fun of last night about oh, all the things that could go wrong. I'm so prepared. It's fine. We are here now together, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. As we said, my topic today is talking about developing your own personal cultural humility toolkit. So what we're going to talk about today with that is where I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more. We're going to do an acknowledgement of the land acknowledgement that we just did in our icebreaker warm-up chat. I'm going to tell you a little bit about TLAM. Most of you are probably unfamiliar with TLAM, although I did see a few familiar names pop up in that introductory chat. Thank you, Christina, one of our founders of TLAM. And then we are going to also talk about building that toolkit. We're going to talk about cultural competence versus cultural humility, some steps that you can take and some questions you can ask yourself as you really start to engage in cultural humility practice. And then also resources for further exploration on the topic. And then we will have time for Q&A. As Jamie said, I do encourage you to ask questions in the chat throughout. Unfortunately, I am not great at looking at the chat while I'm also looking at my slides. So I encourage you to have a dialogue with each other in the chat and to use the Q&A feature. If it's an urgent thing, absolutely, it can be interrupted throughout my session. Otherwise, we will have time at the end to answer those questions too. And our goal for today is I really hope that you all are able to define what cultural humility is and to identify ways that you can begin to or continue to engage in cultural humility practices. A little bit about myself. I like to introduce myself by starting in Ojibwe-Moan, but sometimes that is a little bit, it's people aren't used to hearing it, so I like to just preface with that. So, Buju, Cassie Laporte Indigenous, Makwa and Dodem, Gichioni Gaming and Donjaba. So it's important to me that I can introduce myself in Ojibwe-Moan, which is the language of Ojibwe people. Because I am a direct descendant of the Grand Portage Band of Ojibwe. And what that means is that my dad is an enrolled tribal citizen of the Grand Portage Band, which is in northern Minnesota. Like if you think how Minnesota kind of comes to a point and juts out into Lake Superior, and then there's Canada, that's where Grand Portage is, along the North Shore there at the tippity top. And due to the politics of blood quantum that we cannot get into in a session like this when I'm only an introduction, I'm a direct descendant rather than a tribal citizen. I was raised all over the Western Great Lakes, mainly in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. My dad was in the Coast Guard, and then I chose to remain in this area throughout my adulthood. It's important to me to have this closeness to the Great Lakes. I am currently the director of the Tribal Libraries, Archives, and Museums program, or we more call it TLAM, at UW-Madison's iSchool. I have previously served as the Director of Library Services and Tribal Archives for Red Lake Nation College in northern Minnesota, and I've also been the Tribal Liaison for Minnesota Department of Education in the State Library Services Division. Something that I didn't put on here because I only did it for a year and I feel weird claiming it is also that I taught high school English for a year, which will come up later in the session when I talk about something. And that was in Bemidji, Minnesota. And then finally, I'm a proud mama of two. This picture here is of me and my kiddos last summer in Grand Portage. That's right on Lake Superior. My husband took this photo of us, and it is one of my absolute favorites. We were just celebrating some quiet time by the lake after taking a break from the powwow, and it is one of my favorites. So we often begin sessions and important events with land acknowledgement statements. When Jamie and I first started talking about my session and about being the opening session and how usually those opening sessions are tied with land acknowledgements, I was really grateful that we engaged in a conversation about land acknowledgements. So kind of think to yourself, have you given an acknowledgement at an event and why? What were the steps that you took to do that land acknowledgement? And why did you do it? Are there opportunities or places in your life where it feels like those land acknowledgements have become obligatory statements? You know, I feel like I have been at countless events, especially in the last few years of land acknowledgements have become really popular, where people are very excited for their event and they're like, welcome to this event. We're going to have a great line of speakers. And now for the land acknowledgement. And it feels as though there's just this like tonal shift that happens when it's like, and now I'm doing this obligatory statement and we are going to make it sound very tragic. So there's considerations that I want you to make when you think about doing land acknowledgements, why you're doing them, and what goes into them. So I really appreciated the way we did today's land acknowledgement, which wasn't a statement that we read on a slide. It wasn't reusing a statement that we've used in previous years. Instead, we were taking an action. So on the slide, you'll see I have a list of considerations of things that you should think about when doing a land acknowledgement. First step, which is a theme you're going to hear today, is to reflect. Why are you doing this land acknowledgement, and what is the purpose as it relates to your event, your meeting, or whatever it is that you're doing the land acknowledgement for? And then to do your homework. So many of you said which tribal nation that you were on, or that you weren't sure which tribal nation you were on, and that's okay. But if you were to do a land acknowledgement, we would need to make sure that we do our homework. I can't tell you how many times I've been witness to a land acknowledgement where there have been errors in it, and it just feels like a little bit of an insult of like that we couldn't have taken that time to look into being factually correct when we are doing that acknowledgement. It really just feels like lip service at that point. And then to be intentional about your land acknowledgement, you know, really thinking about your purpose for it. And then this is where the whole high school English teacher thing comes in. It's important that you use all verb tenses when making a land acknowledgement. It is important that we discuss the history, the historical trauma. You don't necessarily need to discuss in detail historical trauma and attempted genocide and relocation and removal, but recognizing that Indigenous people have always been here, are here today, and will be here in the future is incredibly important when addressing land acknowledgements. And on that same note of the high school English teacher vibe is also the tone, and making sure that your tone does not have to be tragic. In fact, my tones are usually educational. I use land acknowledgements like I do now as an opportunity to teach, and also to identify specific actions. So my action, my call to action to you all today with the land acknowledgement is, if you are one of those people who knew which tribal land you were on, wonderful, but your homework is not done. Your next step of your homework or your action item is to look at the tribal libraries, the tribal archives, and the tribal museums of that tribal nation whose land you are on. Have you ever been there? Do you know that they have one? Have you visited the cultural center or the museum of that tribe? What information do you know about that tribal nation? I'm so happy that some of you do know that, but I want you to take that knowledge a step further. And then for those of you who didn't know which ancestral land you're on, that's okay. My action item to you is to find out. I noticed not everybody was joining from Wisconsin, but there are absolutely resources for whatever state you are joining from. If you Google like your state and then like tribal nations, you'll be able to find a map probably similar to what we have here on the screen. Um, and because it is important to acknowledge every single library in the state of Wisconsin and in the country is on indigenous land. And there is a tribal nation that you are closest to, and considering that as part of your understanding of your work as a librarian and a library professional is really important. So this is a little bit of a teaser about the kinds of things that I teach in the TLAM class. So I've already mentioned TLAM a few times, but I want to share a little bit more about it because TLAM is really why cultural humility is something that I care about and something that I've started teaching about. So as I said, TLAM stands for Tribal Libraries, Archives, and Museums Program. It was started in 2008, and it started, I could do an entire session on what TLAM is and how it started, so I will condense it to basically being there are three components of TLAM. It is a service learning course done through the iSchool or the library school at University of Wisconsin-Madison. It is also a student group, and over the course of the last, doing the math here, 17 years, it has become a community within Wisconsin and a true reciprocal relationship between the iSchool and the tribal nations of Wisconsin. So some pictures that we have here on this slide kind of describe a little bit of the type of work we do with TLAM. So on the top left are two students from last spring that are using their phones to photograph some foam core boards. And those foam core boards, there's a whole box of them on the table that you see there, are lists of Ho-Chunk Nation veterans. And due to things beyond the museum director's control, the files in which those were created were lost. And so our students last semester took photos of each individual foam core board and then retyped all of that information so that the Ho-Chunk Nation Museum and Cultural Center could have that data back in a digital file. In the photo next to that is our associate director of the iSchool, Nikki Wiesinger, braiding some sweetgrass up in Red Cliff, where we did a collaborative book club between the tribal library, the community garden, and TLAM, where we held a book talk circle about the book Braiding Sweetgrass. And then we actually took time to learn about sweetgrass, to smell the sweetgrass, and to braid the sweetgrass. And it was really special to me that our associate director was there for this event, traveled up to Red Cliff with us, and is such an advocate for what we do in TLAM. And then the picture below are some students outside of the Oneida Community Library. And they just really like this picture because they love seeing all of the Oneida language signage throughout the Green Bay area. So some of you were joining from that area, and I encourage you to look around, or if you haven't already noticed, all of the signage around the Green Bay area that is in Oneida language, because you are in Oneida Nation. The really cool thing about TLAM is that TLAM was practicing cultural humility before I even knew what cultural humility was. I am now the director of TLAM, but I started as a TLAM student. I completed my undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin, and I was ready to move to Minnesota. I just wanted something new. I wanted a change. And then I learned about TLAM and I stayed. And I am so happy I did because it opened up this opportunity for a professional world that I didn't know quite existed at that point. And I was really involved in the program as a student in both the course and the student group and with something called Culture Keepers. And I was beyond honored to be invited back through the interview process to be the director of the TLAM program. It is truly a special place, and it is a unique aspect of library school that no other program in the nation has. And it's because of the work that has been put in by my predecessors, the folks who created TLAM, like Omar Poehler and Janice Rice, to really intentionally create relationships between the iSchool and our Wisconsin tribal nations. Cultural humility is at the absolute center of what TLAM is and does And it always has been, even before we named this unit in the week where we talk about cultural humility in the course. Without the practice of cultural humility, it's a real slippery slope from service learning and community building to volunteerism and charity work. We are very clear in TLAM that we are not doing any favors to the tribal nations that we are working with. If anything, they are doing us a favor by allowing us to have a learning experience with them in their tribal cultural centers and in their communities. We make sure that we do not have extractive practices in what we are doing, and we make sure that we maintain a sense of purpose and intentionality when we go about continuing to build those relationships. And it's an important aspect of the course that we continue to really engage in a foundational level of learning about tribal nations, unlearning potential stereotypes and biases that students are coming into the class with, and then also relearning what it means to be culturally humble and to go about appropriate, respectful, and responsible relationships. Most of our students in the class are non-Native. Of course, there are some like myself and others that go through the class as an Indigenous person, but most of the students, as is most of our profession, is non-Native. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about cultural humility, but I haven't actually defined it yet. You might be more familiar with the term cultural competence. So I'm going to talk about that first before we shift gears into cultural humility. So cultural competence is a term that's been around a lot longer, and it's something that I think is a step before you get to the point of cultural humility. There is a level of self-awareness with cultural competence, and there's also this attitude that, in my opinion, comes with feeling like you are an expert on cultures other than your own. And there appears to be some sort of endpoint or a mark of completion. There's like a champion or a confidence that you feel in knowing facts about other cultures. And with this idea of cultural competence comes this idea of I know these things about cultural competence or about this culture. I know these things. Like, for example, I had the privilege of studying abroad when I was an undergraduate student, and I lived in the Czech Republic for a semester. I would say that I was practicing cultural competence there. I was very proud of the fact that I could tell you all about Czech history and about the difference between Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic. And I could say basic words in Czech, and I knew about politics. And, I really just wanted to toot my own horn about all the facts I knew about that culture. And it was a journey for myself to really understand that humility was not something, it's not something to be ashamed of. When I was younger, I viewed humility as like dulling my shine, and I was very proud. I was proud of my intelligence. I was proud of my experiences, and I wanted to shine, and I thought that being humble meant that I was trying to dull that shine. And as I grew up, as I had more life experiences, I realized I didn't need to shine in the way that I had previously thought, that there was beauty in humility and in understanding that I am not the center of the universe. And I think we all go through those phases in life where we do believe the world revolves around us. And practicing cultural humility really is engaging in looking inward to yourself, but looking at to how you impact others and the role you have in the world as a whole, while also valuing everybody else's strengths and gifts that they bring to the world as well. Cultural humility involves critical self-reflection. It involves being vulnerable and humble and willing to admit that you don't have all the answers. That was the real ticker for me growing up, because I wanted to believe that I knew it all and I had all the answers. Practicing cultural humility is practicing ongoing learning, curiosity, and understanding. And even if you feel like you've reached expert status, recognizing that there is always more for you to know. I also included an image here of Dabas and Dizawin, which is our Ojibwe grandfather teaching of humility. And I put this in here because if you're, completing that checklist of cultural competence of Ojibwe culture, knowing that there are 7 grandfather teachings is going to be on that checklist. And again, that could be a whole session in itself about the 7 grandfather teachings that I do not feel competent to share in a public setting because I'm still learning myself. But my children and I, every morning, we put down a sema, we put down tobacco, and we talk to our ancestors and we think about our 7 grandfather teachings and we think about which one we want to guide us in our day. And usually, they're 4 and 6. They usually think about love, Zagadiwin, or respect. And those are ones that are easier for them to understand. And I'm constantly like trying to kind of needle this idea of like, but what about humility? And then I think back to like, I didn't know what humility was at 4 or 6 or 20 or even 30. It's a concept that's really hard to understand, especially if you pride yourself on, your own competence and your own ability with things. But being humble is not dulling your shine. It is thinking about, like the wolf, everybody's role in the wolf pack and how everybody's shared gifts come together to make the pack harmonious. Apologies, 1 second. I'm going to blow my nose. Sorry. Again, I have a 4 and a 6-year-old. The cold germs this time of year are just constantly in circulation. There are 3 pillars of cultural humility. I like to think of them as pillars. You might also hear components of cultural humility, dimensions of cultural humility. During this part of the session, there's going to be questions on the screen, and I do encourage you to, in the chat, engage in dialogue with each other about those questions if you feel comfortable, because it is important that you engage in these dialogues and conversations about cultural humility. So while you're listening, if you're able to multitask, if you're a morning person and your brain is already turned on for that way, please do. Those 3 pillars of cultural humility are a commitment to lifelong learning and self-reflection, recognizing and addressing power imbalances, and then institutional accountability. And we're going to kind of take a bigger dive into all these pillars as we think about developing your own personal cultural humility toolkit. Now, again, this is where the English teacher vibes come in. I feel like we use the iceberg a lot when describing concepts that have a surface layer and all that, the good stuff underneath as well. If we're going to talk about cultural humility, we also have to understand culture and identity a little bit. So I'm sure talking about culture is something all of you are familiar with, but in case you're not, I just wanted to have a slide on here to kind of discuss the seen and unseen parts of culture. So for example, today, I have shared Ojibwe-Moan languages and greetings with you. You can't see it, but I am wearing a ribbon skirt because when I do presentations, especially if I'm discussing culture, I want to feel powerful, and I feel powerful when I'm wearing my ribbon skirts. I'm also wearing beaded earrings that I made, and I'm wearing a beaded necklace that my grandmother gave me. I've also talked about the fact that the picture I shared was from a powwow this summer. So I've shared about holidays and festivals. I've shared clothing. I've shared greetings. Those are very visible indicators of my Ojibwe culture. That is one aspect of my identity. I've also shared aspects of motherhood with you, but there are a lot of parts of my culture and my identity that you can't see and that you have to take time to listen and get to know me in order to really understand. And that goes the same with every single person that you encounter in your life and those that encounter you in their lives. There will be seen and visible aspects of our culture and of our identity, and there will be parts that are harder to see and that require time to listen and get to know each other and a little level of vulnerability. And that's just something to keep in mind, especially as we move on to the first component of developing your cultural humility toolkit, which is embracing critical self-reflection. Part of critical self-reflection is thinking about your identities. So the image that I have here on this screen is an identity wheel. Many of you have probably seen identity wheels before or done exercises with identity wheels. I like this one because it's very colorful, although I understand accessibility-wise, it is not the easiest to read. So while I read some of these identities on the wheel, I encourage you to think about these questions. I encourage you to think about which of your identities do you think about most often, and which identities do you think about least often, or maybe not at all? And which identities might you have an implicit bias toward? That can be a really difficult thing to think about or admit that you have those biases, but everybody does. And it's just part of growing and part of practicing cultural humility is addressing and identifying those biases that do exist because we all have them. Some of the identities on this wheel are age, physical abilities and qualities, your ethnicity, gender, race, sexual orientation. Those are in the middle of the identity wheel because those are often the ones that people think about the most. But there are other factors to your identity as well that can't even be completely summed up on this wheel. You've got your communication styles, economic status, your family, your marital status, military experience, your citizenship, your thinking style, your geographic location, your education, your parental status, whether you're a smoker or a non-smoker, and your work background. And again, this list is endless because people are intersectional human beings with a million different layers. But which of those identities, as I was talking about them, popped up for you? For example, I've already spoken a lot about my Ojibwe culture, my ethnicity. And I've talked about being a mother already a lot. Those are two. I've also talked about my job. And honestly, my cultural identity, my mother identity, and my identity as the director of TLAM are probably the three identities that I think about the most often. In terms of that implicit bias, that's important for you to think about, especially in a professional setting in a library where we get so many different folks that walk through our doors every single day. And without realizing it, we probably do have biases. I will admit that one that I have worked on for a long time is I used to have a lot of implicit biases towards essentially like regional dialects and ways that I considered that people were mispronouncing words. Again, this was in my era of being real full of myself and thinking that I knew everything and it was my way or the highway. And I thought that I pronounced everything the right way. And that was a real problem. And that was a real misunderstanding of my own. And it's something that I've worked towards and that I still feel sometimes when I hear words pronounced differently than the way I pronounce them. And that is something that I make sure that I take note of when interacting with people that may pronounce words differently than me. And it is not in any way that I treat folks differently, but it is something that I do need to take active steps towards when I'm in those situations. On the flip side, you can't see it today, but I have a very large visible tattoo on this arm. And when I am in parenting settings, I often think about, should I wear a shirt that shows my tattoo or not? Because I know that there are implicit biases towards people with visible tattoos. And I know that there are implicit biases towards parents with visible tattoos. And that is something that I actively think about in terms of how I'm presenting myself and how others may perceive me. So again, thinking about these biases that we have with identity are an important step in critical self-reflection. And I encourage you to think about your identities, which identities you think about a lot, which identities you think about a little, and which identities you may or may not have biases towards. The next step in developing your cultural humility toolkit is something that I'm sure I'm really going to need to twist some arms about here, and that is about engaging in lifelong learning. Again, I'm going to explain sort of why I chose this picture, and as I do that, I want you to think about the questions that I have on the slide. You can do it in the chat or you can do it on your own, whatever your level of interaction is up for at 9:30 on a Wednesday morning when it is freezing out. So what activities do you engage in to promote lifelong learning? How can we encourage lifelong learning within workplaces and communities? And how do you find more information about things you're curious about? Because remember, cultural humility has no endpoint. There's always more to learn. The reason I chose this picture is, and feel free to pop this in the chat too, because I'm just going to make the chat all sorts of chaotic if you guys are in there at all. What do you notice about this picture? Why do you think I chose this for lifelong learning? I will share. First and foremost, it looked like a book club to me. And I love book clubs, and those are a great way to engage in community and lifelong learning. In addition to books, though, I also see technology. I see someone on a laptop. I see folks in conversation with each other and sitting in a circle. I see that there are plants in the room. And something that I'm continuing to learn about is the ongoing relationship between people and the environment. And that's something I'm really interested in engaging with more. And there's a lot of plants in this picture. And then finally, there are people. Because although people can be scary, and opening yourself up to vulnerability with people can be scary, which is why books and podcasts and websites and resources are a great entry point into learning new things. Engaging in conversation and dialogue with people is going to be your greatest resource in engaging in cultural humility, because that lifelong learning component about how your story and your background fits in with the stories and backgrounds of everybody that you come in contact with in your life is an important aspect of really engaging in that cultural humility work. How do your gifts and your experiences interact with the gifts and experiences and stories of the people in your world? And that's a really cool thing to think about. And I thought this picture really summed that up nicely. All right, building your cultural humility toolkit. Step number 3, we have to address power and privilege imbalances. So I'm using another image here, one by Sylvia Duckworth, called The Wheel of Power and Privilege. Hopefully this is an image, excuse me, that you all have seen before. And it is one that I like to use, that I use all of these images when I teach in the TLAM course, when we talk about cultural humility as well, because this takes that identity wheel that we looked at earlier. And instead of you just thinking about your wedge of identity, it segments your wedge in terms of what level of power your identity has, kind of generally within society. Of course, there are societal contexts in which this changes. 100% there are. I can think of a handful of examples where the power would be switched in certain societal contexts. But generally speaking, the way the majority of folks think, this is sort of those power differentials within identities. So I want you to look at this wheel and think about those top 3 identities that you think about or engage with most often. And where do you fall? Where do you fall in terms of, are you central to that power right in the middle? Are you a white citizen, cisgender man that speaks English and owns property and has a slim build and is heterosexual and able-bodied? Can you identify with some of those things and you are right at that center? Or do different parts of your identity fluctuate throughout the wheel of power and privilege? How does your level of power and privilege shift as you think about those different identities? And also, how does your perception of power and privilege shift as you think about the identities of your peers that you work with, or also the patrons that come to your library or come to your workplace? What sort of power imbalances exist between you and your peers, between you and the community that you serve? And also, what sort of power differentials exist between yourself and your own aspects of your identity? Whether we like to admit it or not, all of these aspects and more do come with inherent power and privilege. And being able to recognize and address that power and privilege is critical in us engaging with cultural humility work and being able to recognize and address those power imbalances. So if you haven't already been active in the chat, here is your moment to shine. Sorry, I am a morning person. We were playing Hulk Smash in my living room this morning at about 6:30, so I am ready to go. But here's your opportunity to enter the chat if you haven't yet. What are some actions that you can take in your professional role to address power imbalances? I'm going to take a sip of water and blow my nose again real quick. And then I will share some of my answers as you all engage in dialogue in the chat about this.
All right, so as Kathy mentioned, feel free to, if you haven't been participating in the chat, feel free to do so at any time. If you're more of an observer, that's okay. That's okay too.
100%.
Yeah, there's a lot of dialogue happening in the chat, Kathy, which is great to see. I'm really interested in what Hulk smash entails. And maybe that's something I need to do to get more energy in the morning. But a lot of great things coming in. Sarah says listening more than talking. Jennifer says being mindful of the space I'm taking up in a meeting. Heather says being an advocate. So keep sharing those ideas.
Wonderful. That is great. Oh, there we go. Nope. Went too far. There we go. Okay, also Hulk Smash is a way that we get our wiggles out in the morning and we stretch our bodies. So it started as doing like wake up yoga with my children in the morning. And it usually almost every day it turns into jumping around and then landing on the ground as hard as you can while yelling Hulk Smash. My 4-year-old was Hulk for Halloween 2 years ago, and it hasn't left her personality yet. Okay, so what are some actions that you can take? Oh, that just changed again. There we go. Actively listening to others, thinking about the space you're taking up. Those are all really wonderful things to come out of the chat. Also collaborating with underrepresented communities on displays and programming, and even just something as simple as considering how you answer questions. So an example that I like to give is temporarily in my role at the iSchool, I am also the iSchool library manager, which means that I supervise a staff of about 15 graduate students that run the public services desk at the iSchool library. And one of the things that we train students on their very first day on the desk are some of those frequently asked questions that come into the library. And one of them, I'm sure you all are thinking it, is where is the bathroom? Which is the question I think every person who's ever worked in a library has answered more times than they can possibly count. And a simple way that we address power imbalances in that is we tell them where all 3 bathrooms are located. We never assume gender identity. We never assume anything about the reason the person is asking that question. We give them, yep, women's restroom here, men's restroom here, gender neutral bathroom here. And that's a simple thing that you can do. So you can also consider some of the power imbalances that might exist in your everyday interactions and how you assume identities or culture when answering questions. But I flipped over to the chat real quick and I love seeing all of that. Y'all are on it. I appreciate it. And also those of you that are just sitting back with your coffee and like, I am here and this is what I can contribute today. I also see you for that. And I completely understand. I appreciate you listening. The fourth component to building your personal cultural humility toolkit is acting upon the pillar of institutional accountability. And I want to recognize that not everybody has power to change things on an institutional level, but we all do have the power to recognize things that our institution could do. So you can think about, in terms of you and your professional role, you can examine policies at your library or your organization. What sort of collection policies, hiring practices or policies, space use, rental, circulation policies, you can re-examine them through a lens of cultural humility and make sure that we don't have implicit biases in those policies. We can review our past programs and professional development opportunities. Are there areas for growth or improvement? Are there ways that we can be better partners with community organizations? Are there better ways that we can serve our communities or serve our staff by engaging in professional development and different programming work? And then finally, and I think almost most importantly, what opportunities exist for further conversations to hold each other accountable? What sort of systems of support do you have with your peers at your own library? Or what sort of systems of support do you have within library professional organizations, perhaps library systems? What opportunities exist for you to hold each other accountable and to have opportunities to engage in these conversations? Rather than tacking it on to, a DEIA committee where, again, that becomes an agenda or a checklist of things for us to do. what can we do as our everyday, day-to-day thing to make sure that we are taking time for self-reflection, lifelong learning, and addressing both power imbalances and institutional accountability. So, of course, this wouldn't be a talk for librarians without some book and podcast recommendations. So I wanted to share with you here a few resources. Of course, there are more, but I wanted to share. There's an ALA special report. That's the one on the left that has the more boring cover, called Cultural Humility, which is wonderful. It's a bit of a drier read, but it is a very good report. I also want to highlight the Cultural Humility podcast. The term cultural humility came about in the health sector, particularly thinking about public health and mental health. So if you're interested in cultural humility in those contexts, this podcast has a lot on that. But what I like about it a lot is it also takes a lot of current events going on in our world, and it examines those events by bringing in speakers and looking at them through a cultural humility lens. And if you want that more kind of passive way of listening and learning to people without having to engage in the conversation yourself, I highly recommend the Cultural Humility podcast. The next book, Hopeful Visions, Practical Actions, I recommend that you all read. It's one of our textbooks in the TLAM class, and it's about cultural humility in library work. It's absolutely wonderful. The other book, Cultural Humility in Libraries, is also great. I have a little bit of a personal preference for Hopeful Visions, Practical Actions, because some of my friends contributed chapters to that book. And I just, it just sits with me a little bit differently, but we all find connections with different books. And then finally, the podcast in the bottom left called Books Are Good Medicine is one I just wanted to highlight as well. If you are interested in learning more about Indigenous culture. It is a relatively new podcast started by the Mdewakanton Sioux tribe in Minnesota. And it is mainly intended for K-12 educators as insights into Indigenous resources and also ways to teach about Indigenous topics. It is run by two Indigenous women, but it has a lot of applicability to librarians, especially librarians that work with youth. And it's a great podcast. It's an easy listen. Some other resources I wanted to recommend are ones we specifically use in TLAM for additional information about Indigenous contexts. So the one in the middle and the one on the right are both books by Patty Lowe. And if you're looking to complete some of your homework I gave you for the land acknowledgement call to action, these two books would be a great place to start. Native People of Wisconsin in the middle looks at all 12 tribal nations and gives a history of them as well as what's going on in present day life. And Seventh Generation Earth Ethics shares specific stories from one member or one citizen of each of the 12 tribal nations. And it has in a way to do with Earth, but it also just really has to do with life and the way you go about living. And then finally, Becoming Kin, an Indigenous call to unforgetting the past and reimagining our future. It does not say the words cultural humility in the textbook, but it is 100% a book about cultural humility. And that's what I'm saying about how TLAM is inherently about cultural humility without us ever really naming cultural humility. That's what this book is too. A few communities around Wisconsin have made this a community read. I believe McFarland did it last year. And I strongly recommend it. It's an easy read, and it does a really great job of giving you historical context, present day context, and then action items for you to do with each chapter as well. And it's just a really wonderful read. It's also a great audiobook. So strongly recommend. So in review, our 3 pillars of cultural humility are a commitment to self-reflection and lifelong learning, recognizing and addressing power imbalances, and institutional accountability. Cultural humility does not have an endpoint. It is not a checkbox of things that you can complete and say, yay, I am culturally humble. It is a commitment to constantly doing all of the aspects of the 3 pillars. So my challenge for you, gosh, I'm giving you so much homework. It is like I'm a high school teacher again. During the remainder of this conference, I really hope that you keep the 3 pillars of cultural humility in mind. And then I hope that you are able to create an action item for yourself to do at work that directly relates to one of those pillars. Think about which of those pillars, depending on where you're at in your journey of cultural humility, speaks most to where you're at the moment, and what is a feasible action for you to start engaging with cultural humility practices. Here is my list of resources because I believe my slides will be made available after the conference is over with the recording. So if you would like the sources on any of the things I used or the books that I referenced in addition to their covers. Miigwech, thank you so much. I am wrapped up now and we still have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Kathy just mentioned we do have some time for questions. And I want to remind all of you that if you, Zoom gives us the ability to ask a question anonymously. So you, throughout the conference, if you want to share a question, you can do that in the Q&A area anonymously if you'd like. So Cassie, you kind of read my mind. One of my questions was going to be, so thinking of our audience here this morning, many of them, public librarians, some at very small and rural libraries. So when you look at an act, you talked about an action item for us. Can you give us an example of what might be a good place to start for someone who wants to, or which, again, not trying to make it about a checklist, but where would be a good place to start? What would be a doable, feasible pillar to start with?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Also, it seems my office assistants are joining at this point. So you've got Theo might come across the screen at some point as well. I'm surprised they waited this long. I think the pillars typically go in order for a reason. And I think starting with some self-reflection components and spending some time with your own identity and your own, cultural identities that you really claim deeply, spending time with those is really important. So those first few slides about the identity wheel and thinking about those, I would start with a step like that and thinking about the way, even though we like to think that as library professionals, we have an anonymous, unbiased view, we are who we are, and we do bring ourselves into the job. And taking those times to critically think about what aspects of your identity impact the work that you do and what aspects of your identity are perceived by folks in the library is important as well, because we do want to make sure our libraries are safe spaces for everybody. And those identities do play a role. If you're not quite ready to do self-reflection, because it can be difficult, looking inward is tough, absolutely. The amount of times I've tried to journal and I've gotten about 3 days into it and I stopped journaling, it's been a lot. You can also do something by looking over, like I said, look over those policies that your organization might have. Many policies haven't been updated in a very long time, and many policies might still have language that is not language that we would use today if we rewrote those. Or even just looking at the types of programming opportunities that you have, and are there opportunities for you to expand or develop new community partnerships and bring different folks into the library? Those are some great kind of entry level steps. Good question.
Thank you. Catherine asked how many students are involved with the TLAM program each semester.
That's a great question. So when I was a student, the class was relatively small. We had about 12 students in it. Interest in TLAM has really grown. Last year, I had 30 students in the class last spring. And it is open to undergrads to take as well. So it is a course through the iSchool, but it is also open to any undergraduate at University of Wisconsin-Madison. This semester, we have 24 students taking it. And then this is the last year that TLAM will only be offered in the spring. Really exciting announcement that TLAM will now become a year-round class. So some folks that are first-year students are opting to take it next fall. And for the first time ever, TLAM will be offered to online students next spring. So that's a really exciting thing for our curriculum as well. So we think the numbers will go up. And we have about 60 students in our student group. So that's students who have either previously taken TLAM or don't quite have it in their schedule to take TLAM at the moment. It fluctuates between about 60 and 70 students in the student group that travel with us on trips, participate in local projects, and go together as groups to different Indigenous events we have on campus and in the Madison community. Great question.
Awesome. So going back to the slide that you showed us about the iceberg, when we talked about culture, I remember a training I was in many years ago, and we talked about, one of the things we talked about was this concept of culture. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I don't have culture. What kind of culture do I have? Is that a question or something that you run into with students, or when you're having these conversations? And that yes, all of us, we all do have our own culture. We should identify with. Could you reflect a little bit on that?
Absolutely. That's a really great question. I actually meant to bring that up earlier. So thank you so much for asking that question. I talk a lot about my Ojibwe culture in these contexts because my job involves working with tribal nations. I wasn't raised in a traditional Ojibwe household. I was raised in what, as you described, maybe is like a cultureless household. We just went about life. We tried to make ends meet, and we went about life. My dad was in the Coast Guard, so maybe we were closely aligned with military culture for parts of my childhood. But everybody 100% has a culture, has an identity, and it just might look different. It will look different for everybody. You might, lean deeply into your culture that is tied with your ethnicity. And that is something, so like my husband is non-native. My husband is also one of those like culturalists, sliced white bread, Wisconsin born guys. But he is deeply rooted in 4-H culture. He is a farm family. 4-H was his life as a child. That is a foreign culture to me. I did not grow up as a 4-H baby, and I am now raising children who engage in 4-H activities, children who go to powwows, children who are starting to learn about religion and thinking about the way religion plays into our life and how that fits in with belief systems. We have identities that have to do with what we look like. My children look nothing like me, and that is very common in a lot of families. So there's all different aspects of your identity and your culture. And you can think about what family traditions do you have, even if that tradition is like, oh, well, we always go fishing on Memorial Weekend, or we always make sure that whenever I'm in town where my grandparents are laid to rest, I go and visit their grave sites. There's all sorts of aspects of our culture that have to do with family traditions and actions that we take as a human being that are important to us as people. So we all have it. Even if it seems surface level, I promise you there is a deeper aspect to it. It's the iceberg, Great question.
Thank you. I think this one question that came in ties a little bit to that. This person writes, I've thought of cultural humility as being inclusive, of not making assumptions that because someone is part of a certain culture that they identify with the things that you have learned about that culture. Mm-hmm. The idea is emphasizing that each and every person's individual experience as part of an X culture is valid, and when shared is something we can learn from. Is that something that is taught as a part of cultural humility?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think you summed that up very beautifully in your question there. Because the thing about cultural humility versus cultural competence is with cultural competence, you tend to paint a broad stroke picture of like, this is what it means to be Ojibwe, or when I studied abroad, this is what it means to be Czech and to be involved in the Czech culture. And I didn't practice cultural humility at that time in my life when I studied abroad, because I didn't take into account all the different aspects of every different human being and individual experience within the country of the Czech Republic, and folks who left the Czech Republic and moved to the Czech Republic, and all those different facets. And, as an educator, that's something that I think about in the classroom too, which is, there's all sorts of educational theories about what sort of theory do you engage in the classroom. And really those ones that always center a student's experience and the experience and the background that those students are bringing into the classroom are incredibly important to what they take out of your classroom experience. And that can be directly translated to the work we do as library professionals, and also the work we do in just our everyday life and how we treat human beings by respecting everybody's individual stories individual gifts and not assuming anything about them because of their connection to different cultural identities, social identities, or personal identities. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. One last question. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, if you
Sure.
don't mind. So when we looked at the wheel, you talked about how for you being an English major, like the language thing is a big
Mhm.
thing for you and something that you've had to reflect on. Maybe it came about not correcting people and understanding that, especially all over, but even in Wisconsin, we kind of have these language colloquialisms, like if you will. Like when
Yeah.
when did that when did that when did you start noticing that? And then I guess what did you do to reflect on that more?
Yeah. Great question. So I don't know that I have an exact pinpoint in time of when that happened, but it definitely was after I left college, after I left my first graduate program. I think it was actually, I have a second master's in curriculum and instruction that I did as an online program. That was my first experience as an online student. And I had to kind of dig into different ways of communicating with people and different ways to engage in education. And it was at some point during that program, also working the job I was working, which was at a tribal college. And I was living in a border town of Bemidji, Minnesota, which is surrounded by three Ojibwe reservations. And I was seeing all these really interesting racial dynamics I had never seen before. I was seeing different student dynamics being in such a diverse online program. And it was at that point that I started my career pretty young. And I was constantly trying to prove to everybody that, like, just because I was young doesn't mean I wasn't qualified to do that work. And I think that was part of where my struggles with overconfidence came through. And it was when I stopped trying to justify myself and really listen and engage in authentic ways that I realized, like, I'm not making anybody feel better by correcting them. I'm not improving the situation in any way by talking right now. And really thinking, which I was voted most talkative in like every single yearbook of my childhood, basically. Um, and I used to pride myself on that. And instead, it's what about me being social and talkative is my gift. And it's about the fact that I think I'm good at connecting people and I think I'm good at relating to people. But that involves me shutting my mouth and listening and really thinking about those individual experiences that people are coming from. And I still have to try to not correct myself. I also come from a family where we like send each other text messages being like, I told you that I was right about this. Here's an article that proves that I was right. Like, I also have a lot of internal family dynamics that I have to battle with as well about trying to prove correctness when everybody has their own right. Everybody has their own correctness in the way that we go about the world. And if we open our ears and shut our mouths a little bit more, I think we'd have a lot more understanding.
I love that we all have our own correctness.
Yeah.
I feel like we could talk about this for a long time, for hours and hours. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Cassie, I want to thank you for being with us this morning, being present, for your energy, for your compassion, for your resources, telling us more about the TLAM program. And I want to thank all of you who joined us this morning, who participated in the chat, and even if you sat back with your coffee too. We appreciate you being here in whatever way you wanted to be here. So we
Absolutely.
have two tracks today, starting at 10:30. We have a management track and then a track in reference and readers advisory. If you didn't sign up for any of the sessions today, you still can by going to our website, Wild Wisconsin. Is it .org or I can't even remember, but if you just Google Wild Wisconsin, you will find it. And I will be moderating the management track. My colleague Jean Anderson will be in the reference and readers advisory. So again, whether this is your last session or we'll see you later, have a great rest of your day and so long.
Miigwech, everybody. Have a great day.